Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hi everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. And with this being the first episode of the month, I'm joined as always by Kelly Barner, the owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and general manager here at Art of Procurement. And in today's conversation, both Kelly and I spoke to Arthur Piszczor, who is a consultant at Corcentric with expertise in the facilities category. And Corcentric, they're a leading provider of procurement solutions that transform how companies purchase, pay, and get paid. They're also members of the Art of Procurement Experts on Demand ecosystem and are also sponsors of this once-a-month Ask the Expert series. Well, Kelly, facilities, a lot of listeners may not know this, is actually a category that you have a lot of experience in from a practitioner side earlier on in your career.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. No, this category, believe it or not, is where my roots in procurement are really from. And for anybody that hasn't managed facility services, I don't know how complex or strategic or interesting to manage you think it is, but it is 100% one of the most interesting, most difficult categories of spend that I have sourced in all of my years, and I love every minute of it. But it does kind of have this reputation internally within procurement. So for instance, I came to procurement not having a background in it. And so I have a category I was associated with. And the group that I was joining sort of took this attitude like, oh, she doesn't have any idea. Stick her in facilities. That's where you put the people that don't have any idea to say no. But I lucked out in the fact that they did. The broad category, facility services, varies greatly depending on what type of industry you're in and what kind of company you have. So the easy examples are things like, well-rounded facility services that cover everything on a property versus just pest control, just janitorial. You might have plant services. There's all of the exterior maintenance type services. And in most cases, they are considered indirect. But if you, let's say, work for a bank that owns a whole bunch of ATMs, depending on the type of property ownership or lease you have, you absolutely consider the management of those facilities direct spend, because those are direct points of contact with your audience. So it's absolutely fascinating. And of course, if it was interesting under typical circumstances, you can only imagine how much more important and strategic and interesting it is, given today's focus on facilities and cleanliness in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we both attempt to keep facilities functioning and also try to reopen facilities, whether they happen to be manufacturing and production, or whether they are restaurants, or whether they are traditional office space. So this is a very timely conversation that we're going to get to have with Arthur about this not well enough appreciated spend category within procurement.
And so let's roll the tape on our conversation. And my first question to Arthur was the one that I often ask. Did you find procurement, or did procurement find you?
Great question. To answer that, I think procurement found me.
Mm-hmm.
As a college grad, I got hired by Fortune 500 electrical distributor. And probably for the first week, I thought I would be selling light bulbs, but they kind of placed me in a procurement-based function, more specifically working with indirect materials And, ever since then, for the last 8 years, indirect materials and, really reducing those costs has been my focus of my career.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into facilities and facilities category?
Yeah, so to piggyback off the last question, while procurement found me, I would say I actively found facilities.
Right.
Interesting enough, in high school, I was a nighttime, part-time janitor at a local office, as well as for a medical clinic. So in terms of janitorial, I've done it all: carpet cleaning, exterior window cleaning, sanitization. So with that effort, with that experience, I like to think I can understand why certain things are priced per location, per service level.
Who knew when you were doing those things and, that would actually set you up and be useful for you later in your career?
Yeah, so that was never the intent. I was a teenager just looking to make some money.
Yep.
The hours were anytime from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. And, a little side perk, my parents never knew if I was working or if I was out with friends. Due to the job. So,
they thought you were working a lot more than you really were.
Yeah. Exactly. So
it's interesting you mentioned janitorial services, because when we think about facility services, I'm sure everyone's background or the company that they currently work for kind of shapes the picture in their mind of what type of facility are you thinking of and what types of services. So from your experience today at Corcentric, what are the industries and the types of companies that you're typically working with to bring their facility services spend under management?
So, facility services, for an outsider, the easy thing to kind of point to is janitorial services. But when I see facility services, it's really a wide array of, trades, services, preventative maintenance agreements, things of that nature. One of my recent projects, large-scale facilities project, we had 18 different scopes of work. So when I say scopes of work, all of the trades, electrical, roofing, plumbing, your general maintenance, all the way down to pest control, fire inspection, all of those kind of nitty gritty. So as I mentioned, a lot of times people think facilities, janitorial, but really it's a wide array depending on the client's needs. So in my experience, the buildings and the facilities are typically either, sales offices, distribution centers, and or your typical manufacturing environment, the loud machines, things of that nature.
So when you look at the services and the decision-making that goes behind bringing them in, do they tend to be, from a sourcing perspective, predominantly cost-driven? Are they quality-driven? How regulated do they tend to be? What are the primary decision-making factors that go into selecting which provider will be brought in to manage the service?
So to answer that question, the clients I've been recently working on, more specifically around facilities, they're companies that are growing via acquisition. So what they're finding now is that they're having, multiple service providers for kind of the same scope of work. So for those projects, they're really trying to get an understanding of, who is the best kind of service provider for that scope of work. In terms of decision making on the conversation around cost versus quality, I would say, anytime prior to March of 2020, it was very cost driven. The trend now with the pandemic, as we sit here and record this, it's really turning towards more quality driven. What I'm hearing from my clients are that, they don't want to call 90 individual janitorial suppliers to either, put services on hold or increase it. Instead, they're looking for one person to contact, one person to have a discussion with, and really have that supplier, that individual responsible for them communicating to 90 suppliers or 90 offices.
Do you find that the specifications are changing as well now as, whereas before it may have been very much a commoditized, here's our checklist of things that I'm going to talk about janitorial, and that kind of category for a moment where it was pretty basic, and now obviously there's a lot more focus on that from a health and safety perspective. Have you seen that in specifications and requirements as companies are now getting into that category where they're actually asking for more than they would have been asking for before?
Yes. So, specifically around janitorial, the CDC is releasing a lot of information around what chemicals can battle kind of the COVID-19 pandemic. With that, they're also releasing, what type of environment should you be using those chemicals. So there's chemicals for residential, commercial, as well as kind of around foods. Mm-hmm. During the time that we're recording, there's over 600 of those products that have been approved by the CDC. So I bring that up because, prior to the pandemic, I think the definition and the expectation was, just make it clean. Yeah. Now, janitorial services are definitely underneath a microscope. They're looking at, how long did that, employee clean that surface? How long did they let it sit? They're now understanding that there's a difference between, cleaning and disinfecting. Mm-hmm. So really, janitorial services are really underneath the microscope at this time. So I advise all of my clients and everybody I talk to really take a look at the CDC website, as they provide a lot of good information, and they're constantly updating it in terms of chemicals and other procedures to help keep your employees safe.
Now, what about some of the other facilities? So if we kind of narrow things down for a minute, let's assume we're talking about some kind of manufacturing or production environment. In addition to maybe having the nature or the specifications associated with your janitorial or other cleaning services change, what other types of facility services or preparedness type concerns are you seeing change as companies are trying to bring these facilities back up to whatever their new normal level of production is going to be?
Right. So, with my current clients, really I see them handling this one of two ways. With your large scale kind of manufacturing facilities, some of those facilities had to go through a mini unplanned shutdown. Mm-hmm. So some of those clients are really taking advantage of, incorporating some preventive maintenance features, calling in some suppliers or some sort of, larger scale projects, moving that along. So really kind of taking advantage of the downturn, of the reduced amount of employees that are in the building. So that's kind of the trend I see for some of my clients. On the other end, it's the exact opposite. It's, this building shut down for no reason should anybody walk into this facility. So really, talking to suppliers, it's all over the board. Some of them are extremely busy in certain areas. Some of them, aren't even allowed to walk into a client's facility. That being said, all of the service providers, are making it very apparent that they're following the CDC guidelines. All of them have PPE, all of them are socially distancing, and that's even apparent when you go on any of their websites, right? They may not be, focused on janitorial services, but the first thing that comes up is, these are the preventative measures that are using and, to stay safe and keep their employees safe.
And when you talk about bringing the suppliers into this, I know you had mentioned earlier that for a lot of these services that were predominantly cost-driven decisions in advance of COVID, now that the implications are being far more understood, right? You're talking about cleaning versus disinfecting, and there's liability associated with all of that. Are you seeing a corresponding change in the nature of the relationship between procurement or the enterprise or facilities managers and those suppliers? Because it was something that was largely transactional in the past, and now it's a far more, I don't know if companies would officially categorize it as strategic, but it's certainly operationally critical during this time of trying to mitigate the impact and bring facilities back online. What are you seeing from a relationship standpoint?
From a relationship standpoint, facility services are very critical. What you've already mentioned. They now see how it's directly tied to employee safety. right? Previously, the biggest kind of safety concerns, were trip hazards, ensuring people had the right PPE. But now we're talking about an entirely different beast, right? You're exposing your employees for just walking into a room where somebody may have had COVID. So really, it's very critical now. From a procurement standpoint, I think procurement has been elevated in terms of how critical they are to the business. I joke that there was a toilet paper shortage, right? Really, that was procurement had to deal with that. The individuals I'm talking to, that was their biggest concern for a week or so, right? They were calling local janitorial suppliers and begging them to ship toilet paper,
Wow.
out of their kind of regions of service just to ensure that their employees had toilet paper. So, with facility services and everything that's going on, I would say it's very critical.
Now, I have a couple of questions related to supply and demand, and it's both from services perspective, but also from the the products as well that they may be using. Because this is some really interesting dynamics, that as you look at everybody coming back to work, but then also the shifting, perhaps even fundamentals of the use of facilities versus work from home. If I look short term and just trying to get whether it's offices, manufacturing sites, warehouses, operational, are you seeing any supply problems in terms of just services providers, being able to find providers who can help sanitize, clean, do everything that they need to do to be able to enable companies to reopen those facilities?
So we are having supply and demand issues. I joke that my clients were, looking for toilet paper for a week, but now it's really kind of turned to the sanitization services. What we're finding now is that there is a supply issue when it comes to sanitization equipment. All of these janitorial service providers want and see the need to provide sanitization services, but unfortunately, all of the sanitization, disinfecting equipment is back ordered. So in my discussions with janitorial companies and companies in that field, they continue to say that they will have that ability soon, but unfortunately, they don't even know when that product will come in.
So is that leading to increased prices then from those providers who actually do have that equipment, who can come and perform those services, because there's fewer and fewer, and obviously there's a greater demand. Everybody wants those providers all at the same time.
Exactly. So, supply and demand, right? Those who have that equipment are certainly kind of reaping the benefits of it. What I'm seeing, interesting enough, is, for those agreements, they're anywhere from, 1 to 2 years, right? And clients kind of feel constrained because although they need this done today, they're signing a 1 to 2 year agreement just to get this done today is a little bit worrisome. So we are seeing that. I am advising clients to look into different types of sanitization. There's the electrostatic spray, there's the fogging. For a lot of the smaller regional janitorial service providers, they're doing everything by hand. But I am advising that there are other methods, as opposed to just, waiting on that supplier to get that machine in.
Right. Now, do you feel that's because structurally this is an industry that, even from a procurement perspective, we've kind of treated it as a commodity. It's always one of those that's held up to say, it's truly a price discussion versus a quality discussion. And so now those suppliers who have been, frankly, beaten up for so many years and probably had a lot of their margin taken away, they see this as an opportunity to claw some of that back. Hence the longer term contracts, but it also kind of makes you wonder where it's going to play out as long-term demand shifts. and as people don't actually work in these offices and facilities. Is that just inherent, or do you find that some of the clients that you're working with, they have nurtured relationships with their janitorial suppliers, for example, in different ways, and those that have had long-term relationships with their providers are finding that they have suppliers who are more flexible?
So, to answer kind of the first part of that question, what I'm seeing is that, suppliers that have the sanitization equipment, they are looking to kind of claw back some of that margin after years of giving up margin, right? But on the other side, in discussions with some of those smaller janitorial service companies that don't have the necessary equipment to sanitize using some sort of machine, they're hurting in the sense that a lot of their employees are saying, we're an essential worker, you should be providing us with additional hazardous pay. So the common theme with some of these smaller suppliers that don't have these disinfecting machines is, they're also getting their margin eaten up by their employees, asking for either additional hours or a higher wage due to the fact, and rightfully so, right, that they are exposing themselves to that risk. So really, it's both sides of the spectrum. The larger national suppliers seem to be kind of taking advantage of this, whereas the little guys, unfortunately, their margins kind of eroding.
And when you talk about the employee sort of risk component, and then this really ties into one of the things that's very important to procurement right now, because we're trying to build those relationships internally. And so those employees that are affected by the janitorial services or by other facility services, those are the customers' voices that we're trying to really hear and respond to. And when you and I had chatted in advance of this podcast recording, you actually raised an incredibly interesting topic, one that even with my own personal background in facility services had not occurred to me, that in this environment of going from clean being important to disinfecting being important, all the way to sanitizing and the different levels of what that means, all focused on making employees feel safe to come back to work. You mentioned that that's taken something, janitorial, for instance, that has traditionally been a procurement scope of responsibility and kind of blurred the lines between where does procurement's responsibility end and where does HR's responsibility begin, because this is now a personnel safety and security type issue. Talk a little bit about what's happened and how HR and procurement are now kind of going back and forth in this area.
Kelly, this answer may get me in a little bit of trouble with the HR department.
That's the kind of answer we like.
Let me state I'm biased towards the procurement argument here. But, in all seriousness, one common theme with all the customers that, we're talking to and advising during these times is, the exec level, the C-suite level, for some reason or another, when they think of employees, they draw that dotted line to HR. And what we're finding now with, sanitization efforts and procuring and, possibly paying more for certain quality or for certain products and services, the recurring theme is that it has to be accepted by HR, which, as a procurement expert, continues to leave me, shocked, right? I understand that, HR does everything they can to, keep their employees safe. But when it comes to, keeping a facility safe, my biased opinion is that should be a procurement function. So this is a common theme that continues to come up, in my discussions with these clients.
Are you finding that most of your clients, and referring specifically to the ones sitting within procurement today, based on past projects, past experiences, are you finding that procurement currently has the right nature of relationship with HR to be able to navigate these waters? Or is this becoming a bit of an issue where we're trying to both maybe either build or repair relationships while also achieving this incredibly important task?
Yeah, so, as time kind of goes on, with this pandemic, I think it's being communicated now that in terms of facility services and sanitization, that this really should be procurement's function. So I think that may have been a, internal power struggle at the beginning, right? When we soon find out that the HR individual doesn't know where to source toilet paper, hand soap, or, sanitization services, right? So, I think that was, quickly resolved, especially during these times. One thing I do urge companies is, very often you hear that companies have now formed a, pandemic response team. I urge all companies to ensure that procurement has a voice there, right? As ultimately, procurement will be the ones sourcing PPE equipment. Procurement will have to call on those relationships to, ensure that their facilities are getting the necessary chemicals, hand soap, toilet paper, trash liners, everything needed.
One of the other things, if this is going to remain within the procurement domain, is going back to that idea that you had talked about with, what's clean versus what's disinfected versus what has been sanitized. When procurement looks at the world, at least in terms of preparing to either source one of these services or put a contract in place to govern its use, we tend to look at a situation, no matter how complex or nuanced, and say, okay, we need to find an appropriate way to define specs, define requirements, put level of service terms in place. There needs to be a quantified way to say this space is clean or this space is safe. But when you bring in the human employee element, there's no longer, okay, we can, on some kind of technical or scientific basis, say that in fact this surface, this area, these pieces of equipment are safe for you to engage with. There's the issue of, does the person feel safe? And maybe that requires something to be visible in a way that doesn't change its application, but contributes to the feeling in the environment, the feeling in the workspace. Any advice on how procurement, with our very traditional, okay, how often does it need to be cleaned? How long does the cleaner need to remain on the surface before being wiped? That sort of very technical clean specification versus a more HR-driven, perception-based notion of clean or safe is something that's a little bit more qualitative. I'm wondering if maybe this is one of those really interesting opportunities for procurement to both, work the specs, manage the contract, address the cost, while also contributing to, an expanded value proposition associated with contributing to employee feelings of safety and cleanliness. How do we balance those two, the technical with sort of the more qualitative notion of safety and cleanliness?
Right. And just to expand on that, right, where I see HR's role in this is really keeping, non-essential employees at home, providing additional, paid time off, as well as extending that if you have any family members that are sick. Where I see procurement really, procurement's part in this is, procurement understands that there's a deeper level of services. They understand there's differences in sanitation. They understand that, the CDC is constantly, publishing a list of cleaners. Along with that, there's, contact times for each cleaner. And what that means is that, if you were to take a look at a disinfectant product, you could actually type in the number into the CDC website, and it'll tell you, how long does that surface need to be wet? As in, you spray the product, how long does that need to remain wet prior to, somebody actually coming with a dry wipe to clean that up? So really, in terms of the conversation of, HR and procurement, my experience has been that, HR means well, but when it comes to the service levels and quantifying that, that's really where, procurement should step in.
I want to jump in with a question related to that as well, and essentially performance management. We're talking about some, technical specifications around how long do you allow a chemical to stand on a surface, let's just say. How can we be sure that our suppliers are actually maintaining those quality standards, especially as we said all the way at the beginning, how quality is more important, really, or at least equally as important as cost is right now? Because those things, I'm speaking as somebody who has never really been involved in this category, so it may be a rookie question. But how do you even manage performance of the janitorial suppliers in these instances?
Yeah, so procedures, documentation, those are great ideas and concepts. But ultimately, I think there needs to be some form of audit, right? So having an individual from your employee or from your company who's employed to check in to really understand. Are the janitors, cleaning and sanitizing everything properly? Are they first cleaning the horizontal surface area, then, sanitizing it with the amount of, contact time that product truly needs, right? A few suggestions that I have made for our clients are, looking at your office layout, kind of divvy that up by, X amount of desks. So your janitor and their procedures, they kind of tackle it area by area. So they know that, these few desks, they'll spray. In the meantime, they can go do this, come back, 10 to 12 minutes later, and that's when they dry wipe that.
Yeah.
Whereas, if that isn't laid out to, certain companies and certain janitors or, and individuals cleaning it, it's essentially useless, right? Quickly spraying something and then instantly cleaning it up with a wipe, it may kill some of the germs, but what's important is that contact time. And if you take a look at, the CDC's website, and it's actually downloadable into an Excel file, you'll see that the majority of the times, I think the average is around 7 minutes, right? And if you watch a janitor or even go to a restaurant and see how quickly, they clean a table off, right? It's not 7 minutes. So I urge, my clients, right, to have that audit, write up procedures, kind of split up their floor layout, their office layout, when it comes to cleaning those.
So I want to thank you, Arthur, very much for joining us today on the pod, talking about facilities and janitorial sanitation specifically. It's obviously a fascinating category right now, and one that was perhaps underloved or underserved before, and has now come to really be one of the most critical areas of spend when we think about getting everybody back to work, getting them into their facilities and warehouses and plants and offices. So really appreciate your insight. And the last question, which I always say in the pod is the easy one. If listeners are interested in reaching out directly and learning a little bit more, what's the best place, or where is the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, so the best place would be LinkedIn. My name is Arthur Piszczor, Piszczor, consultant at Corcentric. Other than that, I do write blogs on Source One Strategic Sorcerer. So if there are any, individuals interested in my thought process on certain topics, I encourage everybody to check out Strategic Sorcerer.
Okay.
As I'm an author there as well.
Great. Well, what I'll do then is I'll include links to Strategic Sorcerer in the show notes, along with a link to your LinkedIn profile. So anybody who's listening today can go directly there and then jump off to those two places. That's just going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. Kelly, I want to thank you so much for joining me and helping me ask the questions today. And Arthur, thanks a lot for joining me. I want to thank you for listening in to our conversation today with Arthur. And the big takeaway that I want to highlight is this rapid shift to larger national suppliers away from local providers that Arthur is seeing in the janitorial industry. Over the longer term, this is going to create new challenges for procurement, both from a pricing perspective as the larger suppliers become more powerful, and from a change management point of view, where my experience is that facility managers are a lot more inclined to protect the relationships they have with smaller local suppliers and resist efforts to bring the larger providers on board. Now, to subscribe to our regular newsletter, the AOP Insider, and never miss an episode, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. You can also subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.